to our missions. And we need to start thinking about how to put those on web as URI schemes so that we can facilitate interlinking. And hopefully we'll start to think about metadata and data as the social object and leverage some of the social media tools that we have available to us today. We may have time for some questions. I'm happy to entertain any of those if anyone has them. And thank you very much. Yes?
I enjoyed your presentation. One of the questions I had was about 8 slides back. You said something about this combination of various sources could be used to develop standards. In other words, taking existing standards and somehow you mash it up with other material and develop new standards. Could you explain how that would work?
Sure. So a lot of voluntary consensus standard organizations' standards, metadata standards, come from use, right? So in many cases, vocabularies exist. So if you want to talk about publishing, you should probably use Dublin Core. So there's a management organization that manages that standard. It's there to use. We should probably use that, right? It's just, standards are good, kind of thing. But in your domain, there may not be anything that talks about atmospheric conditions or whatever the case, whatever the domain is. So when you develop those vocabularies, ideally, you want to do that with the decentralized subject matter experts that virally congregate around that domain. And then you want to push that into voluntary consensus standards organizations. So that we get a lot of standards by what are people doing. And if enough people use that, or if the government says it's important, this is the domain standard, right? Then you want to either have a management organization, like NEAM, for example, or you want to push that into some other VCF voluntary consensus organization.
So just to follow up what you just said, what you're saying here is it's basically a compendium, an aggregation of known information, and then what someone would do with that information, whether they were able to put it into a voluntary consensus standard process and have it developed, that's a separate issue.
Yeah.
But what this does is it basically aggregates what's out there.
Yes.
Okay.
But it's likely that there are specific domains of interest to the administration, let's say, right? So it may be that that particular domain wants to be standardized, and it can happen from the ground up. Other questions or comments? Bob?
Well, actually, I'd like to make a comment about the question, and then I'd like to ask a question.
Okay.
So I just went through the sausage-making process of coming up with a new standard with a consensus building organization that does standards, Object Management Group. And one of the things we wanted to do, which George was sort of instrumental in, was we wanted to take the business motivation model that he was showing and essentially make that part of this new standard. And I'll just say, I'd be happy to talk to you about it offline. It was an extremely challenging thing to do because of the technologies in which the existing standard was encoded. That to try to create a new standard based on it was extremely difficult, and this would have been ever so much more simple to do. And it would have also opened up, to tag on to George's point about the social media, it would have made it much easier for us to have been able to build the standard, because we would have had everybody online doing that work in an environment that's actually made toward building an ontology, right, or a vocabulary. So this would have been great. It just wasn't available to us at the time, plus there were other sausage-making considerations.
Right.
But the actual, so love to talk to anyone who'd like to talk about that offline. Subject near and dear. The question I had, you mentioned one thing in particular, provenance, and then there's just the whole idea of authoritativeness.
Right.
Could you just talk about that for a minute and where the PMO is going in terms of the thinking, or even the community at large,
right,
in terms of the thinking about that and how to be able to guarantee at least certain levels of provenance and authoritativeness?
Yeah, great question. This comes up a lot. Thank you. So two answers to that. One is the vocabulary that expresses provenance, which there are some emerging open standards for. The Open Provenance Model. I think it's openprovenance.org. And the other is named graphs. So there's this concept in triples. So when you have a set of RDF, a set of a data set that is expressed in RDF. That namespace is the qualifier for whether or not it's authoritative or not. Right? So if this is atmospheric data and it didn't come from NASA, and you see this namespace Data.gov/atmospheric data, right, then you would not consider that authoritative. Right? So it's actually quite simple and straightforward. All the tools will process name graphs. So you can query your store and say, just give me data that comes from this particular graph. Right? So that's an important thing that we'll be exploring more. And some of the RPI people are particularly, that come from like the Stanford Knowledge Labs, places like that, are that's their special sauce. We'll be working on that going forward. And to the extent that we use a lot of the vocabularies that our friends in other governments are using, then that too will facilitate linking and merging. We all know that that vocabulary term has this data connected to it, and I use that vocabulary term and it has this data connected to it, and we can merge around that concept. Good. Anything else? Yes?
Just a quick question on tie very closely with
So if we take, let's go actually with an example, you were just using the atmospheric quality data. So you've got NOAA, EPA, the Office of Air Quality, NASA. So at the mission level, I don't think there's necessarily agreement on who has the most authoritative data on certain aspects, right? We're going to run into this. So are you encountering that already, where that's beginning to slow down the IT side of what you're trying to accomplish?
I would say from a workflow perspective and the people, the SMEs that are involved perspective, yeah, we're running into that. Technically, it's not, it's the usual thing. It's the technology is the barrier. It's the whose mission is that anyway kind of question, which is well above my pay grade. So we're just starting to get into that space now because we're focused on vocabularies. But there's a lot more of that wall to beat our heads against. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yeah, go ahead. Speaking of Noah.
I was just going to add, weave into that mix, there are agencies such as the FAA that would use atmospheric data and more specifically forecasting derived from the atmospheric data from several sources and several models. And especially, let's say, this must be used in the weather service, they won't go places. They pretty much, as their subject matter experts, one choose the specific areas. So technology would actually be very useful to help them select what data they want to use in which application.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think it's a good point. And this issue, this challenge of provenance is something that, a lot of open government folks say that we have, we create PDF files because you can't muck with the data that way, right? We can lock that down. And if we do all this open data stuff, then, oh my God, you're going to abuse my data and attribute it to me. So what we're trying to bring the community along to understand is exactly this idea that you can handle that with these technologies. You'll still have issues we haven't thought of, but there are mechanisms to deal with that that are pretty straightforward.
Communities of interest that are working with complex maintenance related to data architecture and the enterprise architecture. I noticed your choice of subjects as a test.
Yeah, well, I guess it was about 2004 while I was at GSA, we took all the FEA reference models and created DL versions out of that and did some interesting work with that. It was a little early on for use, but we, and there are other, there are people that are ontologizing Zachman, and I think, Dennis and Walt, DODAF, there are folks here from DoD that are doing lots of work with architecture frameworks.